From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Congress's ban on TikTok goes to court and maybe eventually to the Supreme Court. Meantime, Boeing begins furloughing workers amid a strike by the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Alicia Finley and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. Earlier this year, Congress passed a law that requires the social media app TikTok to be divested from its Chinese parent company ByteDance by early next year, or it will be banned from distribution and updating by U.S.-run app stores. This has now gone to court at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals on Monday, an appeal before a three-judge panel, the company challenging it along with some of its creators on First Amendment grounds. Let's start with a clip of Judge Naomi Rao tangling with the U.S. government's lawyer on the case.
So TikTok US is a US corporation. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of ByteDance, but it is a US corporation. What about the First Amendment interest there? Does the government recognize that TikTok US as a separate corporate entity has First Amendment rights?
Yes,
of content moderation and, all the other things that, for instance, the presser declaration says occur by TikTok US.
Right. Yes, and those are incidental. TikTok posts things on TikTok US posts things on TikTok, they say, and they engage in some content moderation that occurs after the recommendation engine. The problem there is none of that is what's being targeted here. They're saying that this is sort of singling out a speaker, but that's not what we're going after.
And here is Judge Sri Srinivasan asking a question of the lawyer for TikTok US.
So can I ask you this question then? If under your rationale, suppose the United States is at war with a country, and then there's a question about whether that foreign country can own a major media source in the US while the war is going on. Is your submission that Congress can't bar the enemy's ownership of a major media source in the U.S.?
I think we would still be in the world of strict scrutiny. Maybe that would be a sufficient justification. But I think we would still have to look at those rationales and decide that they were sufficient. And, when you're at war, probably they would. But that's a couple of things to say here. That's certainly not the rationale that they're giving.
Alicia, what do you make of this argument by TikTok that this ban passed by Congress is a First Amendment problem?
So let's back up a little bit and recall how this ban came to be. First of all, if you recall, during the Trump administration in 2020, the administration tried to do it by fiat, essentially issue an executive order and force ByteDance to divest TikTok, or basically do what this legislation does, ban it. Now, that was challenged by TikTok, and it was blocked in part or large part because it didn't have congressional authorization. Now, back in January and actually this spring, Congress passed legislation championed by Wisconsin Republican Mike Gallagher and Illinois Democrat Raja Krishnamurthy, and passed this bill with wide bipartisan support that would force ByteDance to either divest TikTok, so either spin it off into some U.S. or other investors, or would ban it from U.S. platform like the Apple Store and such. And so it actually gave ByteDance a choice. And now ByteDance said, well, no, we cannot do this because actually the Chinese government in Beijing is saying we cannot because our algorithms, get this, the TikTok algorithms are kind of like a secret sauce and they are a quote-unquote state secret, and therefore they cannot be spun off to U.S. investors. And so this is actually an ultimatum. However, Beijing essentially forced ByteDance in TikTok's hand here. Now, going back to the First Amendment question that you raised, well, I think there's actually a very compelling argument that this actually isn't trying to regulate speech at all. It's really regulating conduct. And that is the argument that the Congress made. Actually, Federal Communications Commissioner Brendan Carr made in our pages is that this actually isn't seeking to regulate speech in any way or the speaker. It's regulating the conduct. In a similar situation, somewhat analogous, occurred in 1980s 2006 when the High Court heard a case involving a bookstore that was shut down under a New York State public health nuisance law because it was found that it was being used for prostitution. Now, the owners of that bookstore tried to argue that the shutdown violated their First Amendment rights, and the First Amendment protects the sale of books. The court didn't buy that and said that it was basically the underlying statute was permissibly directed at unlawful content having nothing to do with books or other expressive activity. And I think the same is true here. The underlying statute that would ban TikTok really has nothing to do with the expressive activity, isn't about the viewpoints. And really, as one of the judges in the case pointed out, it's really incidental. Any kind of TikTok speech or even of the users is incidental to the actual activity that it is seeking to regulate.
Monet, what do you make of this case? And one more piece of fodder that I would throw in here is a new report from the Pew Research Center. Just yesterday, it says in 4 years, the share of adults who say they regularly get news from TikTok has grown about fivefold from 3% in 2020 to 17% in 2024. And among Americans ages 18 to 29, the percent saying they get news from TikTok regularly is now 39%. And that is one of the justifications that the government is citing for this restriction on the ownership of what the law calls foreign adversary controlled applications. The other, of course, being questions about data handling, data practices, whether the information that is hoovered up by these apps could be put to nefarious uses if the Chinese government demands it of ByteDance.
Yes, the Justice Department is arguing in its case against TikTok that there is a compelling state interest in the United States of making sure that China cannot control a platform that has reached this scale and this level of influence. Obviously, the United States has an open and international market. We have lots of entities, including broadcast ones, that are controlled by a variety of foreign companies. But that doesn't preclude the government from saying that this particular platform has grown to a size and level of influence that is dangerous, and because it is held specifically by a Chinese government-controlled entity, which is an adversary of the United States, as the judges of the D.C. Circuit acknowledged, then that means that we can create specific legislation to make sure that we're able to curb the influence of TikTok. And I think that this really rose to a higher level of prominence last October after Hamas's killing of Israeli citizens, when we saw this circulation of Osama bin Laden's 2002 letter to America, in which he basically was saying that the United States was at fault in the war on terror and speaking directly to an American audience. This went viral on TikTok around that time, and a lot of people wondered whether this was the result of Chinese influence. There's no proof of that necessarily, but it demonstrated the case that we have millions of Americans who are actively following this platform, which is in the pocket of our adversaries, and we need to take action to make sure that it will either be under U.S. control if they spin off the U.S. entity, or it will be banned from American app stores. And so the idea in this case is, again, that the government can make a tailored bill specifically because of the unique circumstances around TikTok at its scale and because of its Chinese ownership, to make sure that those kinds of influence operations can't be used against American citizens.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in just a moment. Welcome back. Alicia, I find myself pretty persuaded by the government's argument here that what this ban is targeting is the ownership, not the speech itself, not whatever the 170 million some users of TikTok in the United States are posting, and not the choices that TikTok itself is making in terms of content moderation and whatnot that are sometimes deemed by the courts to be expressive activity of their own. I mean, I think about examples from regular media. One of the judges in this case asked that question, how is this any different than laws that prohibit foreign ownership of U.S. broadcast licenses? If there were a bid by a company in Iran, for example, to buy a prominent U.S. broadcasting network or a prominent U.S. newspaper, I can imagine that there would be serious national security concerns about that in Washington. And also, I think it's important, and one of the judges zeroed in on this as well, that this is a bill that was passed by Congress. This was not some attempt by an executive agency to put TikTok on the shelf on its own. This is a judgment of the people's elected representatives, though notable too how the tables seem to have turned, because as you laid out, it was the Donald Trump administration who first started pushing this issue of TikTok's ownership. And fascinating to hear Trump now a couple months ago saying that he is for TikTok because you need competition. If you don't have TikTok, you have Facebook and Instagram, unquote, is what he said. And Alicia, I'll just let you react to all that, I guess, and get off my soapbox.
Right. So a few things here. Again, the legislation gave ByteDance an out. They could have spun off the company to U.S. investors. Steve Mnuchin, a former Treasury Secretary, was reportedly trying to get together a group to bid for TikTok. But then again, Beijing intervened and said, no, we are not going to allow TikTok to be spun off because its algorithms are quote unquote state secrets, which is interesting because essentially TikTok is arguing the opposite here that says, well, we're not subject to the Beijing government at all. Everything is done in the U.S. on U.S. servers, American engineers control all of that. But actually, there's a lot of documentation, and this has been reports and also was brought up during the congressional hearings when they were considering the legislation, that actually the algorithms and a lot of the data, U.S. data, is fed right back to the engineers in China to control these and write these algorithms. And under Chinese national security laws, as it happens, anything that is the property of a company in China, so any data, is actually can and must be handed over to the government if they ask. So it really doesn't provide much reassurance. What TikTok is saying is, oh, we're actually a U.S. company. No, you are subject to the laws of China still. And that gets to the crux of the problem here. You mentioned Donald Trump, and yes, it is hilariously ironic that he is now kind of opposing a ban that he actually tried to impose by fiat. And that's because he's a little irritated still at Facebook and Meta for kicking him off the platform after January 6th. And so, as Trump is prone to do, he gets vindictive and it doesn't really see the principles of arguments. The problem is that he fails to recognize is that TikTok really is subservient to Beijing. And when he talks about like, I'm going to be tough with China, well, what does it mean that you're actually supporting essentially a company that is a mouthpiece for the Chinese government? Now, TikTok will deny that, but as Monet brought up, there's a lot of records showing that it has tried to suppress content that is very sensitive to the Chinese Communist Party and amplify discord. So, like, for instance, when I say content that is sensitive to the Chinese Communist Party, that includes the Hong Kong protests, the Tiananmen Square massacre, the forced labor at Uyghur camps in the Xinjiang province. And then when I talk about amplifying content that they want, I mean, Monet brought the example of the Osama bin Laden's 2002 letter, but also the pro-Hamas videos. And so it seems very much that the Beijing is trying to interfere and the Chinese Communist Party is trying to interfere in U.S. politics. And it's kind of strange that Donald Trump is now actually supporting and condoning that.
It's always hazardous to predict case outcomes from the questioning by judges at oral arguments because they're trying to test the arguments on either side. But my read of this is that the judges seem pretty skeptical of TikTok's argument there. But Monet, I mean, is there any question that this is probably going to get appealed to the Supreme Court? And granted, if the decision in the D.C. Circuit goes the way that a majority of the Supreme Court thinks is the correct outcome, they could choose not to hear the case. But my read of this is that one way or another, the Supreme Court is going to get a crack at this if they want it.
Yeah, I think that that's almost certain given the scale of the importance of the question being considered. Not only is it a matter of huge public concern whether TikTok specifically is allowed to continue to operate in the United States, but it is an interesting legal question. I do think that the signals, as you said, from all the D.C. Circuit judges indicated that they want to maintain the precedent of the United States being able to intervene to curb foreign control of entities of this kind. But the social media era is very new, and it creates a lot of questions that haven't necessarily been litigated previously. And so the justices are going to want to take the opportunity to lay new guidelines that are going to apply to other foreign-owned entities that are operating as broadcast outlets in the United States and show the distinctions between the free speech protections that people have to create and distribute their content on these platforms and the free speech rights of Americans to consume that content versus the control of these organizations by foreign adversaries. They're going to want to lay out clear guidelines for that.